Okay, today's discussion, we're going to continue to talk about the ancient Middle East and move into ancient Greece. Our discussions on the Persians, about the ancient Persian culture, think of their religion Zoroastrianism, which was the predominant faith there for centuries. How about ancient Greece in chapter 3, of the early Greek civilizations, the Minoan civilization, the Mycenaean civilization. And then into the era of classical Greece, talk about the polis system, ancient Athens, ancient Sparta, ancient Thebes. Also some of the different Greek philosophers, important thinkers at the time. Now, look here at the Persian Empire here on page 46, huge area. I'm saying northeastern Africa, and the southeastern Balkans, parts of modern Bulgaria, modern Turkey, most of the modern Middle East, all back to near to India and up into Afghanistan, Uzbekistan, just huge amounts of territory. Now, the different peoples living in this territory, having different beliefs, different traditions, different languages. But for the Persians themselves, they lived under a faith called Zoroastrianism. Now, it has nothing to do with the guy on a sword. It's emerged about the 6th century BC. 7th, 6th century BC, yeah. Founded by a man named Zoroaster. He was born around 660 BC, and his series of revelations he had led him to establish this new faith. In ancient Persia, there was no ways of communicating very well. They used the staging post system the Assyrians and Chaldeans had. Major road systems, getting from point A to point B, so it's easy for ideas and information to spread. Now, the Zoroastrian holy book, it's called the Zend-Avesta. It's their version of the Bible. This thing was spoken orally for centuries. It actually wasn't written down until about the 3rd century AD. Someone's about 700 years later. These priests learned it very carefully and passed it down from one generation to the next. Now, essentially, before Zoroastrianism, ancient Persia was a polytheistic society, many multiple gods, but Zoroastrians basically took one ancient Persian god, main god, and kind of thrust him to the forefront. In this case, a god named Ahura Mazda. Now, the rough translation from ancient Persian basically means wise lord. Zoroastrian faith, Ahura Mazda was the only god, and he was a perfect, basically, greater god, infallible, incapable of imperfection. And this god embodied all the good, positive qualities of the world. You see, for Zoroastrians, good and evil weren't just moral concepts, weren't just ephemeral ideas in the mind, in the heart. These were real, existing things, concrete things, like the table is good, the paper is bad, things like that. Yeah, much more specific, though. And Ahura Mazda encompasses all the good abstract qualities of existence. Morality, faith, they call it, Russia translates to good thought. Think happy thoughts, you're thinking of her Mazda. Piety, morality, these were important qualities for him. But he had an exact opposite opponent. There was good, there was evil. And his name was Arma, basically their version of the devil. And he encompassed all the dark, negative qualities of existence. Darkness, lies, evil, death. And in their ideology, humans played a role in battle between good and evil. And believed that at the end days there would be a final ultimate struggle between good and evil, but good would triumph in the end. So there are a lot of parallels to Christianity, but there are some very distinct differences as well. Now, Zoroastrians believe that the creator, Her Mazda, gave human beings free will, how they participate in the fight of good against evil. And that faithful followers of Her Mazda in their afterlife will go to paradise, the version of heaven. Roughly translated from into Persian, it's they call it the House of Song, or the Kingdom of Good Thought. It's interesting. Belief among the Zoroastrians was when you die, your soul will go to the next world, and you'll have to cross this bridge to get to paradise, the House of Song. But as you go along, the bridge will get narrower, narrower, and narrower, depending on what you did in life. Were you a good person? Did you have a lot of piety and faith? Did you treat others well? And so were you a faithful follower of Her Mazda? If you were good enough, you can make it across. But if not, the bridge narrows down to nothing. You descend into hell.
Like you have to be good enough.
Yeah, you have to be good enough. Again, one of the distinct differences between the Judeo-Christian tradition and Zoroastrianism. Evildoers go to the house of worst thought. Dark abyss of unimaginable pain and agony for eternity. Eternal darkness, torment, and torture. It's like an insurance semi-author. Basically, their version of hell. Actually, that's how they thought belief was the majority religion in Persia and that whole region for centuries, till the 7th century. Well, Persian kings were tolerant of other religions because they're trying to spread this faith. They believe that if they didn't show themselves to be an enemy of those existing faiths among other peoples, and they would stop to consider their religion. Because you can't just force a religion or a way of thinking down somebody's throat and expect them to accept it. So they knew that that's just not how people work. They grow to resent it, to rebel against it, but presented peacefully and among equals, maybe they might. Like I said, there's still a few Zoroastrians left in Iran today. Not very many, but there's still a couple here and there. But most of them are gone now. But what ended up happening over time, though, Zoroastrianism, where it's a monotheistic religion, one creator God, a God of good things that is going to triumph in the end. Because they believe that good and evil are concrete things, over time, Armand kind of became more powerful, more prominent in Zoroastrian society. People have to start using spells and incantations to try to buy off or ward off evil. At the same time, getting praise and homage to their main god. But that was Zoroastrianism. But now we get to ancient Greece. Chapter 3. Here, page 56. See Greece here. Not very well over here. Greece is a rocky, jagged coastline, very mountainous area. This is Greece. Lots of little islands here in the middle. Created out here. Yeah, not exactly scale. Very heavily mountainous. It's very hard to get from point A to point B to Greece, especially in this time of period. It's basically try to get close to the coastline and go by boat. So as a means of survival, Greece becomes a very powerful seafaring nation, or series of nations. And because of getting from point A to point B by boat, become very effective and skilled traders as well. It's a small area, rugged, surrounded by the sea, but it comes from the most influential civilizations of development of the West. So much we have today is owed to ancient Greek thinkers, ancient Greek philosophy. Now, the first of these major Aegean civilizations was an island of Crete. Found that here, probably. Like I say, it developed around 2800 BC, and this is the Minoan civilization. The name archaeologists later gave it, name for ancient King Minos of Crete. We know about the Minoans was as a rich, prosperous culture for many centuries. Largely commercial, they had a sea empire which had trading connections across the eastern Mediterranean. And they reached their height between 2000 to 1450 BC. I think they're really going to best, the most influence, high prosperity, 2000 to 1450 BC. Suddenly, around 1450 BC, there was a sudden catastrophic collapse. Going great, everything's good, and then suddenly, nothing. That was it. Different theories have been circulated for years what happened to them. Some suggested invasion from the Mycenaeans, which were on the mainland. The most popular theories today is tsunami. That's it. The belief is, you can see it's set here on page 56. There was a volcanic eruption on the island of Thera. That's about 100 miles to the north, which caused this massive wave to sweep up south and just pile over and wipe them out. Living here in Arkansas, deep inside the mainland, it's not something we think about. Tides or tsunami or anything like that. We've seen in our own lifetime how devastating tsunamis can be. In 2004, there was a massive earthquake off the coast of Malaysia in the Indian Ocean. So a massive tsunami to the northwest across the entire Indian Ocean. 250,000 people died. No warning. Waves come up, swept over them, pulled them out to sea, and we seen it. So could a tsunami wipe out one island nation? Very easily. Especially they had no warning system at that time. Very little understanding even how tsunamis even worked. United States, we're protected from those things. We have warning systems. Our beaches are very closely monitored by law enforcement authorities. They didn't have that then. Well, the next civilization to come along was the Mycenaeans. So, named that after their fortified city of Mycenae. At a fortified palace about 200 miles from Knossos, which was the capital of Crete. They flourished about 1600 to 1100 BC. Reached their height after the collapse of the Minoans in about 1400 to 1200 BC. Essentially, they really started bringing civilization to the mainland. It's the more recognizable Western civilization. Indications that are emerging as early as 2000 BC. The Mycenaeans, though, ultimately were a confederation of various states, different groups kind of working together. Of these different groups, Mycenae was the strongest. But they were warrior people with a very distinct class system. The Mycenaean system, you had the kings were on top, control. And underneath that, you had your military commanders, your senior officers, priests and bureaucrats. If that had a group called the free citizenry. Put your peasants, your soldiers, so that's basically your enlisted men. And your artisans. Basically your craftsmen, people who knew how to build and make things. And underneath that, the lowest rung of the ladder, the serfs and the slaves. Now, serf, basically, it's a little bit different from a slave. A serf is someone who's basically, sometimes, but basically, they're enslaved by a debt or an obligation, sometimes generational.
Contract.
Yeah, kind of contract. The main difference is serfs cannot be arbitrarily bought and sold, but they're always the bottom of the ladder like slaves. So you're not considered to be free in any society. But overall, it's a civilization that stands for such things as honor, courage, excellence in all things. It's believed the Mycenaean civilization was the inspiration for Homer's epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey. He written several centuries later, but In both of these stories, you have a hero standing for principle, for excellence, for daring courage, basically giving it all for everything he's involved in. Someone's willing to protect family, friends, and personal honor. So it's also under the Mycenaean civilization. You have the famed Trojan Wars. Sack of Troy sometime around 1250 BC. 3,000 years ago. Now Troy is somewhere here in Asia Minor. It was a Greek colony. The Greeks had colonized both sides of the Aegean Sea. But for centuries, some people thought that the Trojan Wars was a myth, even though Homer had written about them in very close detail. Human beings have active imaginations, could have just been made up. So a lot of things. There's no evidence of Troy or what happened to it. So people thought it was Homer had made up. That's until the 19th century. The new field of archaeology is really emerging as a professional field of study. And it had this German archaeologist named Heinrich Schliemann. So he had loved the story of the Iliad since he was a kid. Read it all the time, cover to cover, and was obsessed with finding the lost city of Troy. So he ends up in Asia Minor, at that time was Turkey, and came across like the foundations for a huge city wall system. So it wasn't on any map. No one really knew where it was. All it basically left was just foundation, maybe a couple bricks high, but basically still a city wall had been built there. Huge. But there's this climactic scene in the Iliad where the Trojan hero and the Greek hero are chasing each other around the city walls. And Homer gave out the specific dimensions of these walls, as to how long these walls are all around. Schliemann remembered that and turns to the page of the book and starts running around the edge of these city foundation walls, realizes they're the exact same dimensions. Because he had found the lost city of Troy, lost for 3,000 years. Now, of course, Homer lived centuries after this, but the story had been passed down to him enough times to miss enough generations that he knew that story. And whether the individuals were there or not, who knows? But he's able to get the place right and a lot of elements of it correctly. But unlike what it said in the Iliad, wasn't to avenge the kidnapping of Helen of Troy. No, it wasn't over somebody's wife. It was probably a trade dispute. Far more over money. But where Troy was burned in 1250 BC, Mycenae doesn't last much longer. Itself is very autocratic and not very popular among the other Confederate communities, so it's burned by its enemies in 1190 BC. And after that, you have a period from about 1100 BC to about 750 BC, and that's 3.5 centuries, called the Dark Ages. Time period in which there is very little development. Very little happens. There are very little records of it surviving. It's this kind of gigantic blank spot in history. Times were very difficult. Trade had dwindled almost to nothing. People were very impoverished. Essentially, time of darkness. Well, sometime around 850 BC, Greece starts pulling out of the Dark Ages. Farming starts reviving. Start seeing some migration by the end of the time period. It's starting to revive them. So they start having population migrating over here to Asia Minor once again. Greek colonies called area called the Ionian Coast. The Aeolian civilization, Central Greek and Central Aegean Sea. And the Dorian civilization, I say southwestern Greece. What starts to emerge after the end of the Dark Ages is the Classical period. Now, the Classical period is defined mostly by one thing: the polis, the city-state. Basically, each city and the immediate areas surrounding it were acting as their own countries. Basically, the city, maybe a couple of smaller villages around it, some surrounding lands, very sizable, but basically, that's it. Now, from the central city, the main city be the focus of the social and political activity. Kind of think of it this way: Little Rock being the largest city in the state, most of the medical centers are at, and governmental centers are at. It's basically the central city, the main city of Arkansas. It'd be acting kind of as the polis in that case. Or look at the county level. So you have a large, here in South Arkansas, you have a large county seat, El Dorado, 18,000 people, a county of 40,000 spread across the county. El Dorado is the main focal point of the county. A lot of people living outside the city, but business needs to be done, they come to the city. I think Magnolia and Columbia County and so forth. But within each city, like say inside the city walls, there's this area called the Acropolis. Basically, it's a central meeting place. You had something called an agora, which was a open space. Ever heard the term agoraphobia? Fear of open spaces? That's where the word comes from, Greek. The Acropolis, though, the central meeting place. The agora is an open space for assembly, for public assemblies or market days, things like that. They're big farmers market equivalents. Or if the city's under attack, this place where the civilians would evacuate to for safety. So protected inside the city walls to be safe there. The agora. Several different city-states, most important of which was Athens. It's the largest of them. Eventually comes to dominate the entire area. They reached their height in the 5th century BC. Eventually, it's 12 different city-states they combined into one large one. Population height of 300,000 people. Huge city for the time period. Most city-states, populations ranging from a few hundred to a few thousand, but Athens was the largest of them all, most dominant. Most of the great philosophers, thinkers, and writers we know from ancient Greece came from Athens. Athens was the first democracy.
So 300,000 population.
Yeah, 300,000 people. Like I say, it's a society that believes in civic participation. It is, you are part of Athens, you will do your duty for the community. You're not allowed to sit on the sidelines. You will get involved.
They said their voting was like that. Everyone had to vote.
Everyone had to vote. Of course, it's only the men who do it in Athens, because women didn't have any rights. That's what they thought back then. So they would get together, they discuss issues, rationalize them, discuss them thoroughly. And at Greek trials, they had a jury not of 12 men, but about 100. So they believe that the more people you have, the more collective wisdom you have, so they'd be acting on that collective wisdom. But what usually happens, though, is larger group, the more of the passions of the crowd kind of sweep over it. Now, basically, there were 3 groups in Athens. First was citizens with political rights. Again, adult males. And you have citizens without political rights, women and children. And then they had non-citizens. Slaves, it was a slave-holding society. And resident aliens, that is, people were not citizens but living in the city for business or various things. And the way you became a citizen in Greece is had either been granted by the state, or you had to, or as a child, you had to be the child of a citizen. But they're a big believer in rights and responsibilities. As Aristotle stated, we must regard every citizen as belonging to the state. We must regard every citizen as belonging to the state. So everyone pitches in and does their part. Now, in the period between 750 and 550 BC, just as Greece is getting out of the Dark Ages, see a lot of problems of poverty and overpopulation, and a growing gulf between rich and poor. Remember, there's not a lot of land available, so the wealthy end up taking the best lands first and squeezing out the poor, those that are deeply in debt. So this is spurring a lot of colonization. If you want to go to some place with a little more room, they can start over, start their own farm, own their own land. So they're moving outward. So you have a lot of trading posts out on islands about the Aegean, the Mediterranean, trading ports, commercial concerns, those military fortresses. So here on page 62, you can see where the different colonies of Greece were. And all across on the coast of the Black Sea, southern Italy, Sicily, all the way out towards southern France. The Phoenicians have most of the western Mediterranean. Huge amount of colonies. Greeks got around quite a bit. Now, while they had elected leaders, kings, but sometimes they thought they had to bring in somebody to restore order. Things just got too chaotic, too out of hand. So you see commonly a lot of times in the 7th and 6th century BCs, centuries BC, is the tyrant. It has a slightly different meaning what it means in our terms. Understand? Important idea with translation is there are subtle differences in meanings. Our word origins of a word, how it's used, and how it's used in a cultural context, versus how it be used later on in different societies. It's different things. Tyrant in our time means horrible, awful, dictatorial ruler, evil ruler, horrible human being. But tyrant meant something a little bit different for the Greeks. Basically, it meant one who seizes power by force and is not necessarily subject to the law. What they did with that power once they seized it, that wasn't relevant to whether they were a tyrant or not. Just simply one who seized power by force. Now, the 3,000 years since then, someone who seizes power by force is usually not a very good person. It's not usually that power very well. But in ancient Greece, sometimes they could use it well, sometimes not. Again, for example, the Greek word myth. Myth in 21st century English means a lie. Something's made up. Myth in ancient Greece just meant story, true or not. So then what would happen here is have this power by a local coup. Tyrants to be supported by a new class of rich merchants, and peasants are usually indebted to land-holding aristocrats. Basically, those are trying to break into the upper classes, and those are being held in the lower classes by debt. That situation was so bad, land so scarce, that sometimes lower landholders who were so deeply in debt, they had to sell themselves into slavery to get out of debt. What would often happen is a tyrant engaged in a system of land reform, basically buying out some of these lands from these wealthy landholders and just giving it to the poor. A lottery by letting them buy it, however, for different systems. A lot of them did engage in a lot of important building projects in these cities, building new city walls, temples, marketplaces. But by the end of the 6th century BC, though, the tyrant was out of favor, especially in Athens, where they believe in the law, order, rights, and responsibilities. It's just too chaotic, too unpredictable. And overall, the aristocratic oligarchs, basically the people with all the money and power, they try to dissuade these tyrants from coming to power and being used. But that was ancient Sparta. Now you get to Sparta, differently entirely. Originally, it's 4 small villages. They annexed neighboring Laconia, which subjected them to serfdom. Basically, they conquered this land instead of treating them like normal, like new citizens. Basically, enslaved them. 730 BC, they annexed nearby Messenia. This is all in the southern Peloponnesian Peninsula, basically. This area here. Athens back here, Sparta back here. So Sparta realized they had a lot of problems here. They're a small group trying to hold this much larger group in slavery by force. So instead of letting them go, instead of one of the leaders named Lycurgus engages in a series of reforms, basically totally mobilizing the Spartan state. Basically gearing it 100% towards the military. It starts taking hold by the early 6th century BC. Called the Lycurgan reforms. Each child be examined at birth to see whether they were fit to live. If they were strong and healthy, they'd be let to live. If not, they'd be tossed aside. So for protagonists at infanticide. the age of 7, boys would be taken from their homes with military life barracks. They'd be forced to go to this military school, living away from their families. And here they'd be trained to be soldiers for the next 13 years. So it's a very harsh discipline, beatings, left half starved, try to encourage them to try to steal their food, try to prove themselves to be the strongest. Military education. At the age of 20, they'd enroll in military service. Soldiers could marry, but they still had to live in military barracks until the age of 30. At the age of 30, they could be allowed to vote in the assembly and live at home, but they had to stay in the army until they were 60 years old. Basically, their entire life was the military. All other arts, sciences, philosophy was frowned on. Just devote your life to the military.
That's what Athens is for.
That's it. The Athenians are very clever. They had a democratic society. They had a very powerful military themselves. But Sparta was all about the army. So it's very tough society. They didn't have time for arts and science, but the Athenians did, and they built the civilization, remember, centuries later. And they forced all the other states in their control under the Peloponnesian League, Sparta. Athens put their allies together in what they call the Delian League. Delian League because the main treasury, the island of Delos in the Aegean Sea, some historians call it the Athenian Empire. These two great states vying for power and influence in Greece, it's going to come to a head at some point. I'll get to you next time. So, read chapter 3 of the book for Monday. Are there any questions, comments? All right, pick up on that next time. Have a good day.